On the afternoon of February 7, 1952, a chartered airliner carrying the new monarch of Great Britain landed at London Airport. Before Elizabeth could descend the steps, she remained aboard while a black coat, a black hat, and a pair of black shoes were brought to her. The woman on that plane was 25 years old. Her father had died in his sleep at Sandringham 2 days earlier, while she was spending the night in the branches of a fig tree 60 feet above the Aberdare Range in Kenya, watching elephants move through the darkness below. Jim Corbett, the hunter accompanying the royal party, would later write in the Treetops hotel logbook, "For the first time in the history of the world, a young girl climbed into a tree, one day a princess, and after having what she described as her most thrilling experience, she climbed down from the tree, next day, a queen." The news reached her not at the treehouse, but at Sagana Lodge nearby, where Prince Philip walked her into the garden and told her privately. She had been a daughter when she climbed up, and a queen when she climbed down. And now, before her feet could touch the tarmac of her own capital, before she was permitted to grieve in public, the machine required her to be dressed correctly for it. Lady Pamela Hicks, a cousin of Prince Philip who traveled with the royal party through Kenya, described what happened on that aircraft in plain terms. "A black dress was quickly smuggled on board because we didn't have a black dress, so she quickly had to change. The mourning clothes were found, brought to the aircraft, and Elizabeth changed into them. Only then did she descend the steps. She was met at London Airport by Prime Minister Winston Churchill and opposition leader Clement Attlee, both also dressed in black. That is the first rule a royal daughter learns, and she learns it before she can read. The rules are older than you. They were never written down, and they have never once been broken in your favor. This is the rule book, told through the daughters it bent, and the daughters it broke. The rules didn't begin in 1952. They didn't begin with George VI or his father or his grandmother. They predate every woman who has ever stood inside them. What makes them remarkable isn't their antiquity but their invisibility. They exist in no palace manual, no single authoritative document, no handbook delivered to a royal daughter on her 18th birthday. They live instead in the household, in what is expected without being stated, in what is arranged without being explained, in what is never mentioned aloud because it never needs to be. Britain does not have a written constitution. What it has is a set of conventions, customs, precedents, and understandings, accumulated across centuries, that function as a constitution without ever submitting to the discipline of being written down. The monarchy operates within this larger tradition and amplifies it. When something is unwritten, it can't be formally appealed. When it has no single author, it can't be petitioned. When it has no clause numbers and no amendment procedure, it can't be challenged through any procedure that the institution recognizes. The invisibility of the rule is its enforcement mechanism. There are 3 categories of rule worth understanding. The first governs what a royal woman wears, when, for whom, and to what diplomatic or ceremonial effect. The second governs who she may marry, and under what conditions, and what she forfeits if she chooses a path the institution can't accommodate. The third governs what she may say publicly, and, more importantly, what she must not say, and how thoroughly the silence required of her penetrates the entire institution, from the family at its center to the staff in its domestic corridors. These aren't 3 separate rules. They are one rule with 3 faces. A rule about control, applied to the body through dress, to the family through marriage, and to the voice through enforced silence. The curiosity about how the British monarchy operates at this level is real, and it's vast. A single YouTube video cataloging the procedural mechanics of the crown, roots of succession, rules about portraits, protocols around flags and anthems, has been watched more than 21 million times. That number isn't a niche audience. It's a mass market demonstration of how many people suspect that the visible pageantry of the institution is underwritten by mechanisms they can't quite see. They are correct. What that video does not do, what almost no treatment of the hidden rules does, is follow those mechanisms to the particular category of person who has paid the highest price for them. The daughters. The blood daughters, and the daughters who married in. The black coat that was brought to Elizabeth's aircraft on February 7, 1952, wasn't an isolated incident. It was, in retrospect, the founding fact of the wardrobe she would build over the next 70 years. Royal Collection Trust holds a photograph, accession number 2999978, of Queen Elizabeth II arriving at London Airport from Kenya following the death of King George VI and her accession to the throne. In it, she has descended the aircraft steps dressed in full mourning. The photograph is one of the first official records of her as queen. The first visual document of her 70-year reign is a black dress, chosen not by her but for her, worn not as an expression of personal grief, but as a requirement of the position she was now occupying. Every subsequent account of royal overseas travel traces the same origin. Members of the royal family are expected to always carry at least one all-black outfit when traveling abroad, in the event of a death in the family. No formal written regulation established this. No statute mandates it. Royal commentators and dressers describe it retrospectively as custom, a protocol that coalesced around a single afternoon at London Airport and was never formally documented because documentation was never required. The rule was understood. Understanding was sufficient. The absence of a written text was, as with all the rule's most efficient feature. Angela Kelly served as Elizabeth's personal assistant, advisor, and senior dresser for 25 years. Her authorized account, The Other Side of the Coin, The Queen, the Dresser, and the Wardrobe, published in 2019, describes the scope of the work. Coordinating more than 300 official engagements a year, researching the significance of colors in host nations, selecting the appropriate combination of garment and embellishment for occasions where the stakes were diplomatic rather than aesthetic. The team sewed discreet weights into hemlines to prevent skirts from lifting in outdoor winds. They avoided placing the queen against backgrounds that would absorb her. They chose bright, visible colors for hospitals attended by people with visual impairments. They ensured that a woman at the center of a crowd many rows deep could be identified from the furthest point. Caroline de Guiteau, curator at the Royal Collection, described the underlying principle. From the very beginning of her reign, Elizabeth had an innate understanding of how fashion could lend itself to diplomacy, and color and embellishment communicated messages of respect to her host nation before she even spoke. The evidence is specific and consistent. For the 1953 coronation, Elizabeth insisted that the dress designed by Norman Hartnell incorporate the floral emblems of the dominions, the Canadian maple leaf, the New Zealand fern, the Indian lotus, embroidered in color rather than conventional gold and white. De Guiteau described this as a masterstroke in diplomacy. In 2011, on her historic state visit to Ireland, the first by a British monarch in a century, she wore a dress in Irish green. In 2010, a Canadian tour outfit was embellished with beadwork made by Mi'kmaq Indigenous women. For a 1986 state banquet in China, the dress featured Chinese tree peonies. Specific brooches carried their own vocabulary. The maple leaf brooch for Canadian occasions, the New Zealand silver fern brooch for New Zealand-related events, the flower basket brooch, given to Elizabeth by her parents at the birth of Prince Charles in 1948, worn in her first official portrait with him, worn again at Prince George's christening, worn again at that year's Christmas broadcast. The jewels weren't decorative. They were a sentence. Sophie, Countess of Wessex, explained the practical logic to a documentary crew making The Queen at 90. She needed to stand out so that people many rows deep in a crowd could say, afterwards, that they had seen her. She wore colors that couldn't be missed precisely because her presence, in those circumstances, was itself the message. She couldn't, constitutionally, explain the message. She couldn't hold press conferences. She couldn't give interviews that expressed political preference. She couldn't make speeches revealing private judgment. She couldn't appear on television to give her side of a controversy. She couldn't write publicly about any of the 68 prime ministers she received in audience, or any of the hundreds of pieces of legislation she signed into law, or any of the moments across 70 years when she was asked to embody, with composure, something that the constitutional position required of her, regardless of her personal view. What she could do was stand in the right color on the right day in the right country, and let the garment carry the communication her position made unavailable to her voice. Her clothes were, in the end, the only sentence she ever wrote alone. That is what the rule built. Over 7 decades and across hundreds of visits, the wardrobe became Elizabeth's single, unchallenged medium of expression. Not because she selected it freely, but because everything else had been foreclosed. The black coat at London Airport wasn't the beginning of a fashion story. It was the first lesson in the only language that would be permitted to her for the rest of her life. The second rule has a number and a date, which gives it an unusual clarity among the rules we are examining. The Royal Marriages Act 1772, formally an act for the better regulating of the future marriages of the royal family, 12 George III, Chapter 11, received royal assent on 1st April 1772 and remained on the statute books for 243 years without significant amendment. It was proposed by King George III in direct response to the private marriages of 2 of his brothers to women the king considered unsuitable. His brother Henry, Duke of Cumberland, who had married the commoner Anne Horton in 1771, and his brother William Henry, Duke of Gloucester, whose secret 1766 marriage the king learned of only the following year. The mechanism of the act was absolute and applied without age qualification. No descendant of King George II, male or female, close to the throne or remote, old or young, could contract a valid marriage without the prior consent of the reigning monarch. Consent had to be signified under the Great Seal, declared in council, and entered in the books of the Privy Council. Any marriage contracted without that consent was null and void. A provision existed for descendants over 25 who had been formally refused consent. They could give 12 months' written notice to the Privy Council of an intention to marry, after which the marriage became valid at the end of that year, unless both Houses of Parliament had expressly declared their disapproval in the interim. The distinction between these 2 procedures matters and is consistently misunderstood. All eligible descendants needed consent regardless of age. The 12-month notice was available only if consent had already been explicitly refused, and the person was already over 25. In the Act's entire 243-year existence, that fallback mechanism was never once invoked. The Act had been generating constitutional discomfort since its introduction. It applied to Princess Margaret. She was 22 years old in June 1953 when a tabloid reporter at the coronation noticed her brush a piece of lint from Group Captain Peter Townsend's RAF uniform. Townsend himself reflected on the incident years later. That little flick of her hand did it all right. After that, the storm broke. But the storm, as Chips Channon's diary confirms, had already been building since at least February 1953, when Margaret had announced within the household her intention to marry Townsend. The coronation incident didn't begin the relationship. It made the relationship impossible for the press to ignore. Townsend was a decorated Battle of Britain pilot who had entered royal service as equerry to George VI in 1944. He had divorced his wife in 1952. The obstacle wasn't procedural but theological. The Church of England, of which the Queen was supreme governor by constitutional designation, held that Christian marriage was indissoluble and opposed the remarriage of a divorced person while their former spouse remained alive. For the monarch to grant Margaret consent to marry a divorced man would have placed the crown in apparent endorsement of exactly what the Church condemned. The government of Winston Churchill concurred with this position. Townsend was posted to Brussels as heir attaché at the British Embassy, removed from proximity to Margaret, and both were told to wait until she was 25 and the situation could perhaps be reconsidered. She waited. In August 1955, she turned 25. Documents declassified under the 50-year rule and reported by The Guardian in January 2004 reveal that a compromise had in fact been quietly negotiated. The plan, hammered out between the palace and the government of Anthony Eden, provided a route under which Margaret could marry Townsend if she renounced her rights of succession and those of her children, accepted a civil ceremony, and, this detail wasn't disclosed at the time, potentially retained her HRH title and her civil list income. The machinery was in motion. The path was open. The terms were available. On October 31, 1955, the BBC interrupted its scheduled programming. A statement was read from Clarence House. 4 sentences. "I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others. I have reached this decision entirely alone, and in doing so, I have been strengthened by the unfailing support and devotion of Group Captain Townsend." Read the statement carefully. It acknowledges that civil marriage was possible, subject to conditions. It cites church teaching and Commonwealth duty as the reasons for refusal. It makes no mention of what specific terms had been proposed, what financial provisions had been drafted, what she stood to keep or surrender. It claims the decision was reached entirely alone, and it ends, not with accusation, not with grief, not with any word that might require a subsequent statement, with gratitude for the man she was relinquishing. The third rule, already at work. The marriage rule had claimed a far more powerful figure 19 years earlier, Edward VIII, who reigned for 326 days without being crowned, spent the autumn and early winter of 1936 working through every available alternative to abdication. He proposed a morganatic marriage. Wallis Simpson would be his wife, but not queen. Their children wouldn't inherit. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin submitted the proposal to Cabinet, which rejected it. He then consulted the Dominion governments, Australia, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, and the Irish Free State. Every one of them refused to approve. Edward spent weeks in that autumn and into December attempting to find a configuration of circumstances that would permit him to keep both the throne and the woman. None was made available to him. On the 10th December 1936, he signed the Instrument of Abdication at Fort Belvedere, witnessed by his 3 brothers. His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act received royal assent at 1:52 p.m. the following day. At that exact moment, Edward VIII ceased to be king. That evening, from Windsor Castle, introduced by BBC Director General John Reith, he addressed the nation. "I have found it impossible to carry out, as I would wish to do, the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king, as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love." The machine had removed even a king. A daughter encountering the same requirement 19 years later never stood a different chance. The marriage rule wasn't a preference, or a tradition susceptible to the right argument, or a guideline with exceptions built in for compelling circumstances. It was the structure. And the structure had been there longer than any of the people it caught. The Royal Marriages Act 1772 was repealed by the Succession to the Crown Act 2013, which came into force on the 26th of March 2015. Under the new law, only the first 6 people in the line of succession are required to obtain the sovereign's consent to marry. A marriage contracted without consent is no longer void. Instead, the person and their descendants lose the right to succeed. The punishment migrated from the marriage itself to the bloodline it might produce. The rule still exists. Its geography has narrowed. Its architecture hasn't changed. The third rule has the least official existence and the most comprehensive enforcement. Never complain, never explain. The phrase moves through accounts of the royal household the way a phrase moves through a family. Everyone knows it. No one quite remembers who first said it, and the uncertainty about its origin has become part of its meaning. Various attributions have been proposed: Benjamin Disraeli, Stanley Baldwin, the palace as undifferentiated institution. The earliest attributed print source is John Morley's 3-volume Life of William Ewart Gladstone, published in 1903, which credits the phrase to Disraeli retrospectively, drawing on no contemporaneous record. Whether Disraeli said it's unverified. Whether the royal family operates by it isn't. In January 2023, Prince Harry described it in a television interview as the family motto, then immediately added, "But it's just a motto." That small correction contains the entire paradox of the doctrine. It's a motto in the sense that no one has formally codified it. It's more than a motto in the sense that it shapes every significant institutional response to anything that threatens the public presentation of the crown. In practice, the royal family does not address criticism publicly. It does not hold press conferences to explain its decisions. It does not issue clarifications when coverage is inaccurate. It does not appear on television to give its side of events when events are misrepresented. When a family member is wrongly accused, or correctly accused, or placed by circumstances into a situation that a straightforward statement would resolve, the institutional response is continued public duty. A composed face at the next engagement. Silence on the matter itself. This looks, from the outside, like discipline. From the inside, the effects are different. Frustration with no legitimate outlet does not disappear. It accumulates, and it finds the people closest to it. The silence does not end the pressure. It contains the pressure until the container fails. The silence doctrine wasn't confined to the family. It saturated the institution to its foundation. The rules handed to domestic staff weren't always formally written, but they were precise. Don't discuss the household's private business outside the building. Don't draw attention to yourself. Don't speak unless spoken to first. The same requirement that governed the princess governed the woman who made her fires. Not as a personal imposition from one particular employer, but as the institutional logic of a place that had operated this way for a very long time. This is the below-stairs mirror. The silence that shaped a royal daughter was the silence required of everyone around her, which means the information about what the silence cost couldn't leave the building, except in those moments when someone decided, with complete understanding of what it would forfeit them, to break the rule. Marion Crawford, who served as governess to Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret, and later published The Little Princesses, discovered what those consequences were. Her memoir cost her all access to the family. Not a prosecution, not a legal action, simply the withdrawal of the world she had inhabited. The enforcement required no mechanism beyond the institution's ability to simply close its doors. Speak, and the doors close. That was sufficient. The silence rule made the other two rules sustainable. Without it, the wardrobe constraint could be named and publicly argued against. The marriage prohibition could be challenged in the press by the women it affected. With it, both rules remained half invisible, maintained not by force, but by the absence of any voice the institution recognized as authorized to describe them from the inside. Her clothes were, in the end, the only sentence she ever wrote alone. Margaret was the clearest case because she was blood. She had been formed by the institution before she was capable of examining it. She understood its requirements the way one understands a language absorbed in childhood, not as external constraint, but as the given shape of the world. When the situation required her to issue a statement on October 31st, 1955, and the statement took a particular form, composed, brief, uncomplaining, unexplaining, full of gratitude for the man she was releasing, She produced exactly that. The training had been thorough. She lived at Kensington Palace for the rest of her life. She married Anthony Armstrong Jones in May 1960. Lord Snowdon, as he became. They had 2 children. They separated in the 1970s. In 1978, she became the first senior member of the royal family to divorce in 77 years. Her public role contracted through that decade and the next. Her formal HRH designation was preserved until her death. She gave no interview about what any of it had cost. She died on 9 February 2002. The doctrine held. That is what it looks like when the doctrine holds. The women who married into the institution arrived without that formation. They came from outside, with no childhood immersion in its particular logic, and were expected to adapt at the speed the institution required. No curriculum existed for this. No senior family member was formally assigned to explain it. The rules simply operated, and the new arrival either learned to move within them or didn't. Diana Spencer was 19 years old at the announcement of her engagement on February 24, 1981. She married Charles, Prince of Wales, at St. Paul's Cathedral on July 29th of that year, in a ceremony broadcast to hundreds of millions. She had, as it happened, grown up on the Sandringham estate. Her father had leased Park House from the Crown, and she had played as a child with Princes Andrew and Edward. She wasn't a stranger to the world she was entering, but knowing the exterior of a place is entirely different from comprehending its interior logic when you are living inside it and subject to all 3 rules simultaneously. What the institution required of a Princess of Wales was, in the abstract, not complicated. Attend official engagements, dress correctly, produce the succession. Don't contradict the official account of the marriage. Don't become, through your own charisma and the public's appetite for you, a presence that exceeds the institution's capacity to manage. By 1992, there were indications that the last of these requirements was becoming unmanageable. Andrew Morton's Diana, Her True Story, was published on June 16, 1992, drawing on material Diana had actively provided. The photograph taken in India that same year, Diana sitting alone before the Taj Mahal, the marriage's failure legible in the geometry of a single figure and an empty space beside her, required no caption and received many. On November 20, 1995, she gave the BBC Panorama interview to Martin Bashir. She described what it had been like to be inside the institution without adequate support. She acknowledged the difficulty of the silence requirement. She said, precisely, what the doctrine required her not to say. The institution had no framework for this. It had the composed face at the correct occasion, the scheduled engagement honored, the appropriate dress, the silence maintained. It had no category for a Princess of Wales who found the silence intolerable and announced this on national television to an audience of tens of millions. The machine couldn't accommodate what Diana was because the machine had never been designed for accommodation. It had been designed for requirement. Diana and Charles divorced in 1996. She lost her HRH designation upon the divorce. The style that remained was Diana, Princess of Wales. She died in Paris on 31st of August, 1997. She was 36 years old. Sarah Ferguson, who married Prince Andrew on 23rd of July, 1986, followed a different route to an outcome that rhymed with the same structural pattern. The tabloid press pursued her with an intensity the palace found professionally difficult. The relationship between her and the institution deteriorated across years, and the formal instruments of royal status, civil list income, household standing, HRH designation, became points of tension in the deterioration rather than sources of stability. By 1992, the marriage had publicly failed. By 1996, the divorce was complete. There is a comment that surfaces regularly in online discussions of the British monarchy. A comment that has become, in its frequency and its specific phrasing, a kind of shorthand for what a particular audience has understood about the institution without having a structural vocabulary for it. It runs approximately like this. It's ludicrous and cruel to use one particular family for breeding humans to be used for ceremonial purposes. The word breeding is chosen to provoke, and it provokes because it's structurally accurate in a way that the more decorous vocabulary tends to obscure. The institution does not need its daughters to be complicated, or troubled, or searching, or visible as the full human beings they are. It needs them to be present at the right occasions, dressed correctly, composedly silent about anything that might require explanation, and productive of the succession. When a daughter can do these things, the relationship functions. When she can't, because the requirements are incompatible with a human psychology that won't stay indefinitely contained, the machine has no mechanism for accommodation. It simply continues requiring. Margaret gave up Townsend and stayed contained. The statement from Clarence House was 4 sentences. The cost of writing them was 47 years of silence. What that cost amounted to isn't in any public document, because the rule that covered it was the 3rd rule. Diana couldn't stay contained even at moments when she attempted to. The institution she entered in 1981 had been shaped by centuries of the same 3 requirements and had never developed a mechanism for importing a person formed by different values and teaching her to move within them. It simply continued requiring. Within 18 months of the ceremony at St. Paul's, the gap between what Diana Spencer was and what a Princess of Wales was required to be was already visible to people inside the household, if not yet to the world outside it. The machine had no use for what she was. It had use for what the role required. These weren't the same thing, and the institution had no protocol for the gap. Somewhere today, a suitcase is being packed for a royal daughter going abroad, and inside it, folded with practiced care, are a black coat, a black hat, and a pair of black shoes. She didn't choose them. She wasn't asked. The rules were never written down because they never needed to be. They are inherited like the titles, packed like the jewels, and obeyed like the tide. Elizabeth obeyed them for 70 years. From the February afternoon in 1952, when she descended the steps of a BOAC Argonaut at London Airport, dressed in mourning that had been brought to her on the aircraft, until the September afternoon in 2022, when she died at Balmoral Castle at the age of 96. 70 years of diplomatic color, embroidered emblems, and brooches chosen for the occasion. 70 years of saying, in the only language the position permitted, what the position wouldn't permit her voice to carry. Her clothes were, in the end, the only sentence she ever wrote alone. Margaret was bent nearly in half by the rules. She issued the statement on October 31, 1955, and she married Lord Snowdon in 1960, and she lived in the apartment whose floors had been stripped to the attic level and rebuilt in her chosen colors, and her public role contracted through the 1970s, and she died in February 2002. And in the 47 years between the statement from Clarence House and her death, she gave no interview about what the choice had cost her. The doctrine held, and the daughters who married in discovered, usually within 18 months, exactly what the machine had use for. Not their complexity, not their particular visibility as human beings, not their need to speak about what they were experiencing. Their presence at the correct occasions, their composure, their silence. The machine isn't cruel in the way that a person who intends harm is cruel. It does not plan injury. It simply has requirements that predate every person caught inside them, and when those requirements can't be met, it has no capacity for accommodation. It can only continue requiring. The requirement for mourning dress at London Airport in February 1952 wasn't designed to humiliate a 25-year-old who had just lost her father. It was simply a requirement, older than her, indifferent to her grief, that the institution couldn't waive. The correct appearance was required. The correct appearance required the black coat. So the black coat was found and brought to the aircraft, and the aircraft waited, and Elizabeth changed. The plane circles, the coat waits. The rulebook is still being written, in the only ink it has ever used, other people's lives.